It was almost 2 in the morning when I heard 3 loud knocks on the door, so dry and precise that they seemed to cut through the silence of the house like a cold blade. I was sitting on the sofa, trying to distract myself with anything that would ward off, even if only for a few minutes, the loneliness that had become my greatest companion since my husband's death. The TV was on at the lowest possible volume, just as background noise so I wouldn't feel so alone in that space, too big for just one person. But at that moment, the soft sound of the television vanished from my consciousness. All that existed were those knocks, as if the early morning hours themselves had come to collect a debt. My heart raced immediately. It wasn't a normal time to receive visitors. No one knocks on a widow's door at 2 in the morning with good news. For a few seconds I was paralyzed, holding my breath, with the irrational feeling that if I didn't move, perhaps whoever was outside would leave. But the knocking came again, even more firmly, as if insisting that I needed to answer, that this was urgent, inevitable. I mustered my courage and walked to the door, my hands trembling even before I touched the doorknob. When I opened it, I came face to face with 2 police officers. Both were in uniform, serious, illuminated only by the reflection of the lights from the patrol car parked in front of my house. The slowly flashing blue light made the scene even more surreal, as if I were trapped inside. A nightmare I couldn't wake up from. What truly frightened me, however, was their expression. It wasn't hostility, nor concern. It was determination, as if they had come with a very clear purpose. "Madam," began the one in front, his voice firm, "we need to speak with your husband." The impact of those words was so profound that for a moment I felt my legs tremble. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The question echoed inside me, as if it had been uttered at the bottom of a well. "Your husband." Those 2 words brought back all the memories I had been trying to bury night after night. The hospital, the diagnosis, the waiting, the last breath, the funeral, it all came rushing back. When I finally managed to speak, my voice came out low, trembling, almost a whisper. "My husband passed away." The 2 police officers immediately exchanged glances. It wasn't the kind of reaction one would have upon hearing about a death. Not surprise, not empathy, not sorrow. It was doubt, clear. Doubt, etched in their eyes. As if I had said something that didn't make sense. As if I were hiding something. "He passed away months ago," I repeated more firmly, because I wanted them to understand, to believe. My chest began to burn with that familiar feeling of sadness that always came whenever I was forced to pronounce those words aloud. But they kept looking at me as if it didn't solve anything. The policeman on the right stepped forward, tilting his head slightly, studying my expressions as if trying to decide if I was telling the truth. And at that moment, something began to deeply trouble me. Why were they there? Why did they want to speak with my husband? What made them believe he was still alive? Why did my explanation seem to be useless to them? Curiosity, mixed with a growing fear, began to take hold of me. It was as if, suddenly, I had been thrown back into the most painful moment of my life, and now someone was telling me, without saying it, that perhaps it hadn't been enough, that the story wasn't over. "Ma'am, this is very important," the police officer insisted. "We need to confirm some information with him." That made my stomach churn. How so? Confirm information? What could my husband have done, left behind, or signed? What kind of investigation would involve someone who is no longer alive? What would make them knock on my door in the middle of the night? As I tried to process the questions multiplying in my mind, a feeling I couldn't name began to grow inside me. It was a mixture of indignation, fear, and exhaustion. I had already lost so much. I had already been forced to deal with so much suffering. And now, those 2 men were opening up my grief as if it were an old drawer they had every right to rummage through. I felt my eyes welling up, but I took a deep breath to avoid breaking down right there. They kept watching me, as if they expected me to confess something, as if my pain was just a detail amidst what truly mattered to them. "I can show you the death certificate," I murmured. Not because I wanted to prove anything to them, but because I suddenly felt I needed to prove to myself that all of this had really happened, that I wasn't going crazy, that my husband was really gone. The police officers said nothing. They just kept watching me with that strange expression, a mixture of disbelief and urgency, which made everything even more disturbing. And at that moment, standing in the doorway of my own house, thrust back into grief, I realized something that made my heart race even faster. They weren't there by mistake. They weren't there confusing names. They weren't there because of a delayed document or a poorly filled out form. They were there because, were they sure that my husband was alive? And that thought, that absurd possibility, caused something inside me to break once again. When they said his name had come up in connection with an active investigation, it was as if all the words had finally found a way to pierce my torpor. For the first time since opening the door, I felt reality take on dangerously sharp contours. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't a routine visit. There was something concrete and urgent, connected to the man I had buried with my own hands. The policeman who had spoken narrowed his eyes and pulled a heavy briefcase, crumpled from use, from inside his vest. He placed the briefcase on the doorstep, as if that small gesture confirmed the seriousness of what was to come. "Madam," he said, his voice now lower, as if weighing each syllable to avoid causing more alarm than necessary. "Your husband's name has appeared in records related to a case we are investigating. We need basic information, places he used to go, people he associated with, if he had any recent conflicts. Any detail could be important." At that moment, an avalanche of memories began to roll through my mind. Not just memories of the man I had loved, but pieces I had never dared to fit into the eye. Same puzzle. Late-night calls he didn't want to explain, trips he claimed were for work, but which never left any proof, conversations cut short when I entered the room, expressions I had interpreted as tiredness that now took on a different, more dangerous tone. For years I had chosen not to see. For years I had sought refuge in the comfort of the known version of my husband, the dedicated worker, the caring father, the loving partner. Now those misplaced pieces were surfacing with a burning insistence. I explained what I could, the long business trips he took, almost always leaving on weekends and returning with hasty excuses, the phone calls he answered in a low tone, far from my ear, the mailbox I once found hidden in the closet, which he said contained only receipts. I remembered the night he came home smelling of gasoline and with wrinkled clothes, saying his car had broken down and that's why he'd made an unexpected stop. Details I'd never paid much attention to. Each memory I mentioned was a small thread that could lead to a larger ball of yarn. The police officers were taking notes professionally, but there was something in their eyes that told me what really mattered wasn't just my memories, it was what was on the papers they were carrying. Among the documents were flight records, bank statements with unusual transfers, and reports mentioning a name, my husband's name, associated with people and places I had never heard of. One of these reports, dated a few months after I lost him, seemed to point to suspicious movements between distant cities. I read those lines with sweaty palms and a chill running down my spine. That's when the younger policeman snapped his fingers, pulled photos from inside the folder, and showed me one, a grainy image, taken from a distance, in which a figure very similar to my husband appeared entering an unmarked building in a city hundreds of kilometers away from where he had died. The photograph was recent. My stomach churned. It was impossible. And yet there it was, proof that called into question everything I had believed until then. "Madam, we understand this is difficult," the officer said, "but we need to be transparent. There are indications that someone is using his identity for activities that may be criminal. There could be fraud, there could be information trafficking, there could be something bigger. That's why we need your cooperation and, if possible, documents proving the death to eliminate possibilities and advance the investigation." Hearing those words, I felt the house spin, as if the ground had given way beneath my feet, and I was about to fall into an abyss whose bottom I couldn't yet see. I showed them the death certificate, the funeral photos, the hospital records, everything I had to prove the end of that story. I handed over each page with a strange feeling. It was necessary to prove the absence of someone whose loss I carried as if it were an extra body, even with the papers in hand. The police remained cautious, and I understood that, for the investigation, documents and feelings were distinct things. The certificate stated one legal truth. The evidence they presented pointed to another. And in the gap between these two truths lay a dangerous one. As we talked, I also began to remember the small contradictions that, at the time, I had accepted as mere annoyance or weariness. There was a credit card bill he swore he hadn't used, an address on a piece of mail that appeared, repeatedly, and which he attributed to a supplier. Names of people who, when I asked, received evasive answers. With each detail I revealed, the police officers took notes and exchanged glances. Glances that I now clearly saw conveyed a mixture of surprise and confirmation. This went far beyond a name lost on a list. There were patterns, there were indications that my husband's past hid layers that I hadn't been able to decipher. Suspense began to grow inside me like a shadow stretching across the house. If someone was using his identity, who could that person be? Had my husband been involved with her? Or was he being used by others? And if it was something he had chosen, a double life built on choices I had ignored or justified, How would I react when I found out? Reality seemed to fragment. The man I had buried might have been a mask, or the mask might be being used by someone else. In either case, the feeling was the same. The security I had known had evaporated. The police asked permission to enter and search the house, rummage through records, and, if possible, check computers and files. I asked them to just be a little while, resigned and petrified at the same time. They promised to be quick. But in that tacit agreement, there was also an implicit promise that in the end, I would know the truth. And that promise was a double-edged sword. I wanted to know. I needed to know. But I feared with all my might what the answers might reveal. When the door closed behind them, I felt the weight of a past I thought was over return, even heavier. Something of what he was, or what he hid, was coming back to haunt us. And I, who until then had only dealt with the pain of absence, realized that I was now the only living person who could explain, or at least try to explain, the entire life of the man I had loved. The responsibility fell on my shoulders like a cold cloak. The mystery that hung in the air was no longer just theirs. It had become mine as well. The house seemed smaller when the police entered, as if the walls had closed in to hear what was about to be revealed. The air was thick, heavy, and each step I took toward the office felt like sinking my feet into an invisible floor of quicksand. I wanted to show them the definitive proof. I wanted to end this absurd mess once and for all, but something inside me trembled as if sensing that nothing would end, that in fact, everything was about to begin. As we walked down the narrow hallway, the older policeman cleared his throat. The sound echoed too loudly, as if amplified by the uncomfortable silence that filled the house. He stopped, looked at his partner, and then called my name with a gentleness that made me even more uneasy. Before we look at the documentation, there's something we need to tell you. When I heard that sentence, my whole body went rigid. I didn't want to know anything else. I didn't want to hear anything that could open the door to more pain, more doubts, more questions. But backing down at that moment would have been useless. The policeman continued. Her husband was recently seen, in another city, by more than one person. I turned to him so quickly that I felt a snap in the back of my neck. The words made no sense. They were so jumbled as to become indistinguishable. The sound continued there, hovering in the air. Was seen, recently, another city, like small fragments that shattered the logic of my reality. That's impossible, I replied, almost voiceless, my heart pounding so loudly it could be heard in my ears. I buried my husband. I saw him. Dead. I was there. The police officer nodded understandingly, but his expression didn't change. He wasn't trying to calm me down. He was preparing me, and that hurt even more. We believe someone is using his identity, he explained, but there are witnesses saying they saw a man with the same characteristics, walking alone in an industrial area, entering abandoned warehouses and talking to people known for illegal activities. We can't rule out any possibility until we are certain. That was it, the turning point. The moment my life shattered for the second time, but this time, not because of death, but because of the possibility that death hadn't been the end. I didn't know what was worse. The idea that someone was impersonating him, using his name, wearing his memory, or the idea, however absurd, that he might still be alive, somehow, somewhere. I gasped for breath and continued, walking to the office, opening the door with difficulty. My hand trembled so much I could barely turn the doorknob. The room was dark, and the light took a few seconds to come on, seconds that felt like years. When it finally illuminated the room, I saw the box of documents where I had kept everything related to the hospital, the funeral, what remained of his life. It was a small box, but it carried a weight that only I knew. I knelt before her and began to take everything out. The death certificate, still with that heavy, cold stamp. The medical report with details I never had the courage to reread. The funeral photos, taken because my family insisted they would be important in the future, and which now looked like scenes ripped from a horror movie. The burial receipts, the signatures, everything. Each document I removed seemed to pull a piece of my heart away with it. It's all here, I murmured, my voice heavy with a mixture of despair and anger. Everything. He's dead. I was there. How could they have seen him? The police officers approached. The younger one picked up the death certificate, glancing over the printed lines as if searching for flaws, erasures, anything that would justify the impossibility of it all. The older one observed the photos with an almost reverent care, as if he knew he was holding more than proof. He was holding the end of a chapter I had fought to close. But then suddenly, the younger policeman turned pale. Pindisai, Color simply drained from his face, and for a moment he seemed to forget how to breathe. His eyes widened, and he looked at me as if he had just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. "So," he said, his voice trembling, "who is using his identity?" The question landed like a blow. It wasn't just an investigative question. It was an accusation against the universe, an affront to what I believed to be true, a door opening onto a dark corridor I never wanted to enter. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The whole house seemed to hold its breath. I felt the tears streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. Not from sadness, but from fear. A deep ancestral fear that rose from my stomach to my chest, to my neck, as if I were choking. "Do you think he's alive?" I asked, knowing full well that I didn't want to hear the answer. The older police officer shook his head. "No, we don't believe that. But we do believe that someone is very interested in making it seem like they are. And usually when someone tries to use the identity of a dead person, it's because the plan involves something big, risky, and dangerous." Dangerous. The word echoed within me, filling every empty space left by longing. I closed the box slowly, as if closing an altar, trying to organize my thoughts. Nothing made sense. Nothing was logical. It was as if my grief had been hijacked by an external force, and now I was being pulled into a narrative I didn't choose to live. The police officers carefully collected the documents. They weren't just verifying my husband's death. They were witnessing, along with me, that death hadn't ended his story. On the contrary, it seemed to have been the beginning of something even darker. And then, with a serious look, the older policeman said, "Madam, get ready. This is far from over." It was true. I felt it deep in my soul. The mystery wasn't coming together. He was opening up, and I was trapped right in the center of it. The clock showed almost 3 a.m. when we gathered again in the living room. The yellowish lights created long shadows that moved with my breath, shadows that seemed to dance to the rhythm of the fear spreading through the house. The police officers exchanged glances before speaking, as if they needed to confirm among themselves whether I was in a condition to hear what was to come. But I already knew deep down that nothing they said would be simple, nothing would be light. That kind of visit never ended with easy answers. The older police officer approached and sat on the edge of the sofa, maintaining a firm but careful posture. He held the briefcase he had brought from the beginning, now much heavier, not from the papers, but from the information that was finally about to be revealed. "Madam," he began, in a voice that blended authority and respect, "we need you to understand that what is happening is not just about an isolated apparition or a misunderstanding. Your husband's identity is being used in potentially dangerous activities. And this didn't start now. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. It was as if my body had turned to stone, fixed in pain and disbelief." He opened the folder and spread several printed photos across the table. Some showed security camera footage, blurred, dark images, but enough to send a chill down your spine. There were also copies of forged documents bearing my husband's name, signatures mimicking his, and reports mentioning, transactions dating back months before his death, and also months after. Each role seemed to hit me in a different way. "These activities," the officer continued, running his finger along one of the documents, "include suspicious financial transactions, meetings in remote areas, and links to groups investigated for information trafficking, smuggling, and even international fraud." My heart raced. I didn't recognize any of it. It was like hearing about a complete stranger, but a stranger who carried my husband's name, his identity, his story. "Why would anyone do that?" I asked, feeling my voice falter at the end. The younger police officer responded this time, in a more direct, more concerned tone, because her husband, before he died, was involved, consciously or not, with people who didn't want to lose the access, connections, or advantages he offered. With his death, these people lost that connection. So, someone decided to rebuild it, only using his name. My stomach churned. A mixture of anger and fear coursed through my body like an electric shock. "Are you saying," I said slowly, trying to remain lucid, "that someone brought back, not my husband, but his identity?" The younger police officer took a deep breath. "Exactly. And whoever is behind this knows what they're doing." For a moment, I felt the world darken around me. Everything spun, the pain of loss, the brutality of that early morning, the feeling of being ripped from my own reality. I stood up from the chair, pacing in circles around the room to avoid falling. I ran my hands through my hair, over my forehead, trying to organize the emotions that came like violent, uncoordinated waves. Fear, anger, confusion, and surprisingly, something new, a spark of determination. Because even though I didn't know what my husband had done, or who he had been with, or what shadow he might be trying to escape, I knew one thing: that story wasn't over. Not for me. Not while someone out there was using his name as if it were a mask. I approached the table again and touched one of the photos. It was an image of a man entering a metal shed. His silhouette, the way he walked, his posture, everything reminded me of my husband, but I knew it couldn't be him. I had seen death in his eyes. I had held his hand when it grew cold. If this man isn't my husband, I whispered, then who is? The older policeman crossed his arms and replied with a weight that filled the entire room. That's what we're trying to find out. And whether you like it or not, you're now part of that investigation. It all fell upon me like a sentence, not of imprisonment, but of destiny. I was no longer just the widow of a man who carried secrets. Now I was the only witness capable of distinguishing what was truth from what was shadow, the only thread that could lead to the identity of the person who was using his name, the only one who knew details of the real life of the man behind it all. And at that moment, I realized that his story, the story I believed had ended on the day of the funeral, was only beginning to reveal its darkest side. Those involved in this, the officer continued, are dangerous. People who don't like to leave loose ends. We need you to be careful. Don't go out alone at night. Don't answer unknown numbers. And please, anything strange you notice, let us know immediately. I nodded, without really feeling my arms. The adrenaline was no longer enough to keep my body steady. Something much bigger was happening. The older policeman put away the documents and prepared to leave. Before crossing the threshold, he looked at me seriously. If her husband hasn't returned, someone brought his shadow, and someone is hiding behind it. The door closed. Silence returned. But that silence was not one of peace. It was the silence of someone who knows they are no longer alone. I stood there in the middle of the room trying to take a deep breath, trying to understand what had happened. But deep down, I already knew. The shadow that now walked using my husband's name wasn't just a police threat. It was a personal threat. A ghost that walked without a body, but left very real traces. And even though I was afraid, something inside me awakened. I needed to find out the truth, not only because of him, but for me. Because if his story wasn't over, neither was mine. If you enjoy this type of story full of mysteries and plot twists, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Do you believe someone can actually come back from the dead? I want to know your opinion.